skill set that people paid me decent money for to the material that we're talking about, right? The conspiracy material. So then trying to look at it more objectively, because that's always the tough part, because, you know, as we talked about before the call, you inevitably appeal to your own biases, right? So in this case, if it's like, if you're a white man, you're going to inevitably focus on the anti-white part. If you're Christian, your anti-Christian part, whatever. And you can take that like to infinity. So what I tried to do is zoom out and pick apart, like, what are the elites actually saying in their own work? Now I have about 20 books written by the global elite on my bookshelf right next to me right now. So Klaus Schwab, David Rockefeller, Zbigniew Brzezinski, Frankfurt School, and the list goes on. So one thing that I did a little while ago before this was dig into their own material, right? So look at their books, look at what they actually say they want. You know, so for example, Zbigniew Brzezinski actually details out, he was a national security advisor for Jimmy Carter, big Zionist type guy, mentor to Barack Obama. And he details out in his book, The Grand Chessboard, which I have there, that the real point of the Middle Eastern wars, which was actually to create a Eurasia, right? So in this case, to create like a pipeline that goes from China through to Israel through to the European Union. So by clearing out that land, of course he doesn't say it this openly, but this is in the book. By clearing out that land, you create a global trade system, right? Which can go basically from China all the way to Europe, and of course Israel, who always seem to be in the middle of everything, were in the middle of that trade route. So that's just one example of when you dive into their own material, how much they actually give you, how much they actually tell you about what they want to do and why. Rockefeller's the same, and the Frankfurt School's the same. So after diving into that stuff, when the scamdemic happened, I started to see the trends of many of the things that I'd read prior actually happening. But even with their own books, it's a great bird's eye view, but it's obviously not specific. So in this case, it's like, how does actually David Rockefeller's ideology affect my life specifically? You know, we know about central banking, we know about many of these things. So that's when I kind of had to dive back into Agenda 21, because the missing link between the global elite and the New World Order is how is it implemented? Like, what is the string that takes global elite to the outcome of the New World Order? There has to be something other than just ideology and central banking that actually implements this political structure, and that is Agenda 21. So after diving into that, doing a deep dive, I've got the publication, the Agenda 21 document. It's like 200 pages and 40 chapters. I mean, it's a nonsense read, but you have to read it. And I started seeing the trends of what was happening in the COVID thing. So regionalization is one. You and I think you're one of the only a few people that I know on the sort of, let's just call it on the right, that saw early that this wasn't good for nationalists, when it's like, oh, borders shutting down or this, that, or whatever. You know, that's because it's called regionalization. In Agenda 21, they want to break up nations into regions. The end of the nation state is one aspect. The other aspect is to create gridlock regions, right? So this is in the UK. You can see this really obviously with the tier system in different parts of the country. That's part of regionalization. So in America, it's less obvious because we have a state system, but it's still there. So that's one thing that I saw very early on that was happening. The other thing was, of course, vaccinations. As part of Agenda 2030 in particular, one of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals is indeed health, like good health and well-being. That's number 3 of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. Well, if you actually dive into what good health and well-being is, it's essentially mandatory vaccinations. So you start seeing these trends, and of course the economics. Another aspect, of course, is that they want no poverty. And of course, we know from the communist 20th century what no poverty actually means. It means crushing everybody, and it means centralization of resources. So I began to basically see all these trends, you see all these connections, and then you go, oh, okay, so the COVID-19 thing is what I've always called the battering ram, which is, if you want to clear out a structure, like let's say you just bull in a china shop style, you need something to run through and just smash everything up, and then you can come in and rebuild the shop, right? Like, oh, what a mess! We better call in the insurance company and we better clean this place up. And it's similar to that. So COVID-19 is never the end goal. They will switch back to climate change, which we can talk about. But they needed COVID-19 to get some of this stuff through, because it just wasn't, the climate change thing just wasn't doing it. So you start to see all these links. And that's kind of what brought me to this very early on, and that's how it's been fairly easy for me to predict their steps. I mean, I haven't got everything right. I actually did think they would keep Trump in. But aside from the Trump thing, I think I've been pretty on the money with everything else for the whole time.
Yeah, I think you have. And yeah, just to say, it looks like I've managed to work out how to record directly within Telegram. So nice. I've begun doing that just at the beginning of you talking there. So for anyone who's listening to this on Odyssey or YouTube, you will have come in while Mark was speaking, before Mark was able to properly introduce himself, and before I was able to introduce him. So I'll just quickly introduce him now for the benefit of those people. Mark is someone he's a Brit who lives in Arizona now, who very early on last year in April, at the beginning of all of this, the lockdown nonsense, I saw Mark, a presentation that Mark had put up on Facebook, where he kind of zoomed out and gave a sort of overview of how COVID played into a bigger agenda. So Mark and I have connected on Telegram, and we've been planning to do this chat for a while. So here it is, and I think that about brings people up to speed. Yeah, what you said there, Mark. What interested me particularly there is how you noticed that the tier system that was particularly well implemented in Britain, how that plays into this regionalization versus nationalization view of it. Because I remember some years ago, and you probably remember this as well, Mark, I remember there were kind of these leaked maps that were supposedly being put out by the EU of Britain having been carved up. So you had, I think you had like Wales and Cornwall was now grouped in with Western France, as opposed to with England or Britain. And then you had like I forget exactly, but it was something like that, where you had like Scotland was grouped in with the North Sea, and then you had like the eastern part of England and the lowlands of Scotland were grouped together with the lowland countries, Belgium and Netherlands, something like that. And this was something that a lot of people who were opposed to the EU were sharing about and using as evidence that this kind of EU agenda was seeking to break up the composite nations of the UK. I must admit, at the time, I thought it was a bit fantastical. I'm open-minded to anything, and I considered that this could be something that they wanted to do, but I didn't really see how they'd be able to achieve it. I'd actually forgotten about that completely until you just mentioned the tier system and everything. And what we saw there was effectively English law being implemented regionally as opposed to nationally, which is kind of unprecedented, really, isn't it?
Yeah, and I felt the same way when I first saw those maps, like back in 2012. I was like, well, that's a bunch of bullshit. They're never going to be able to pull that off, but that's the March 2020 paradigm shift, which is like the 9/11 paradigm shift, because that's kind of what we're witnessing, right? It's we've witnessed a completely a massive shift in culture and politics that can only be achieved through such a big psychological operation. But except this is like 9/11 times 1,000. But in this case, I agree with you. That's how I felt when I used to see it as well. Until this happened and I started seeing it playing out, and then I was like, "Holy shit, that's all real."
Yeah, I know. It's when even the likes of yourself and myself, and probably some of those listening, can be shocked by what's happening. It really makes you. It makes you wonder whether the shock is actually part of the agenda, which I think it probably is, and that goes to what you were saying about COVID being a battering ram. You know, that they're using it to destroy not just the current system, but all of our expectations, not just kind of normie expectations, but even the expectations of people who've long been kind of cynical and had a dissident view of government and knew that about this new world order agenda. Even many of us have been shocked by this, and I can't help wondering if that's kind of part of it. You know, we've all been part of this kind of initiation, regardless of where we stand psychologically and how prepared we were for it.
Yeah, for sure. You know, one of the things I did in my very first Facebook Live, so this is like late March of 2020. You can't really find those Facebook Lives anymore. The account was deleted, but I do still have them. Some of them saved on the Google Drive and on YouTube. So you know, the lives are there. They're just not timestamped to the time. But end of March, I would say, I did a Facebook Live and I spoke about this exact point, which is the main point of this whole psychological operation is a trauma. So I have a great book here, which if I could recommend one book to understand mind control, it would be this one. It's called Transformation of America by Kathy O'Brien. So she was a mind control victim. It was written in the mid-90s. She was an abuse victim of many of the elites, Clinton types. You know, this is long before the Q nonsense ever existed. You know, because that Q nonsense just takes parts of work that exists and then pretends that it's new, pretends it's their idea. But in this case, Kathy O'Brien talks about what they do to break someone's mind. And there's two very important things she mentions in Transformation of America, which we've experienced en masse. One is masking. She said that when they used to abuse her daughter, they used to mask her daughter. Part of this was to dehumanize the child. Part of it was also, I think part of it is also for them to dehumanize her for them, right? Like it's harder to abuse someone when you know they're human. So you have to dehumanize your enemy as well. So there's that aspect to it. And the other aspect is trauma-based mind control works in the sense that when you undergo heavy, quick trauma, your mind somewhat like compartmentalizes. So in this case, you're able to start honeycombing your brain into compartmentalized beliefs. So you're able to like hide a part of your belief system, for example, like why am I wearing a mask and hiding for a 0.05% fatality rate? Well, it doesn't matter anymore because you can't reason like that because your brain has been fractured, and that belief is in a separate honeycomb pot to the belief that you need to wear the mask. Hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. It does, and it also opens the gate to blind obedience. But doing something that you know doesn't make sense, and something that is so obvious to those who are in control and those around you. I mean, once you've done that once for such a significant amount of time as people have been wearing masks, there's really very little that you're willing to accept through simply being. It's simply being demanded of you. You know, there's that. It's a way of kind of destroying the kind of pride in critical thought. You know, so
yeah, right. And the other thing is when you're in trauma. So this is another important part, and this is what I said in the Facebook Live. I actually didn't go into the Kathy O'Brien stuff just because it's way too much for normies to like start like spouting satanic ritual abuse, but. But you know what I did mention is that your brain is very susceptible to new ideas when you're in trauma, and this is the same even if you're in individual trauma. Like if your dad dies or something happens to you. Of course, if you go through some kind of abuse, this is why abusive parents, abusive partners, and of course abusive states understand this. They know that in a place of trauma, your brain is malleable, right? You infantilize the person. Because when you're in a state of shock, in a state of fear, you're just looking for anyone around you who knows how to deal with the situation. So in the first few weeks, I caught on to this pretty quickly. And I'll be honest, I mean, I knew always what was going on. I actually have a screenshot of Facebook post on February 25th, 2020, saying that this was going to be economic. But I had no idea that it was going to be more than that. I didn't know it was going to be as expansive as it is. I didn't know it was going to be this big psychological mind control ritual. So when you're in that susceptible state and you go through trauma, you're just looking for anyone who can guide you, right? And so then they step in and they become the person that guides you. And I believe it only takes 60 days. I think this is something else that I mentioned in that first stream. 60 days to create new conditions of behavior, right? So
I think
like
you did,
you want to quit smoking, or which I probably really, I smoke like a 1950s soldier, so I probably need to at some point. But this, when you're doing this sort of, this kind of reconditioning behavior, it really only takes 2 months. So by mid-May, June 1st, 2020, people were already like new people because they had their brain fractured. Then they'd been susceptible to this new way of life, and then they were guided to the end result of that new way of life. So unfortunately, it's been over a year that people have already been new people.
Yeah, and now they're new people in a more literal sense, with the injections, because that's the injections are kind of like the final nails in the coffin, because there's, whereas you can kind of, 6 months ago you could come back from having worn masks and been obedient in that sense, and you could, many people probably could have found the humility to say, okay, I was duped and I shouldn't have done that. I think, for example, Conor McGregor, the UFC fighter, he came out hugely in support of lockdowns and things, as little as a few months ago. But apparently now he's done a huge 180 on that and admitted that he was wrong to do that. But the problem is, once you've been jabbed, once you've had those jabs, then you are not just kind of emotionally invested, but you're physically invested in this new paradigm.
Right. Yeah, it's skin in the game thing, right? Once you have skin in the game, you're in the game, right? So it's kind of like having children. It's like once you have children, it's like there's no going back. You're in the game now. That's it. So and it is really like that with this whole new way of life. People have invested so much in it that I just can't see how they would do a U-turn at this point.
Yeah, I liken it to, over the years, I've gotten in trouble for criticizing the armed forces and their occupation of Afghanistan and Iraq in the wake of 9/11 and the war on terror and this. And I've got in trouble for criticizing them because, they react very, very strongly. And I don't know if anyone else has ever had this experience with armed forces personnel, but they react very, very strongly, most of them, to the idea that they have been participating in those wars based on lies. And the reason for that is because many of them have probably killed people. And once you've gone that far, once you've done something that extreme, then to admit that you did that based on a lie becomes that much more difficult. And I see the injection, I refuse to call it a vaccine program. I see the injection program as a kind of similar thing. Once you have had that, gene altering injection, you're invested in it. You've done something extreme based on those lies, and it becomes that much more difficult to accept that you've been lied to. And so instead of reacting against, instead of railing against those who lied to you, or those that you've been told have lied to you, you rail against the messenger, the person that's telling you've been lied to. And we're going to see a lot more of that with the injection program coming up. Right. But just if we could, I think we've kind of dived straight in the deep end here, really. But for the sake of some people listening, maybe we should just very kind of concisely and as simply as we can explain what Agenda 21 is.
Yeah, so I know that for the recording, some people might not have been here at the beginning. So just to reiterate, Agenda 21 is the political framework of what people call the New World Order, right? So Agenda 21 is the actual implementation. So we know about central banking and wars and certain tribes of people doing certain things, but there has to be a political framework that actually binds the ideology of this global governance to a public result.
Yeah, a public-facing aspect of the agenda, because they do need the public's participation to bring it in. They can't do it completely absent the public's participation.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
So an Agenda 21, while you won't see that label on anything, so a lot of people think it's some kind of weird conspiracy theory because they don't see it. I'll explain why that is, but it's actually very straightforward. But it exists in every nation on Earth, or at least 180 nations on Earth, and all, of course, the Western nations. So it's the political implementation of a global governing structure to control all land, water, and air, as it says so in the Agenda 21 document. So you can find out. The justification for this is climate change. So in 1992, they launched this document, which is essentially to save the planet from climate change. And to do that, they have to centralize all resources, which happens to be land, water, and air. And people will read that and think, well, that's okay. Let's think about it. What isn't land, water, and air? That's the entire planet. That's everything. That's where you live. That's where you eat from. That's where you travel. That's where you drink. That's everything. Like, that's the entire planet. There's nothing that isn't land, water, and air. So that's what they stipulate in their document. So it is the centralization of all resources across the world to save the world from climate change. This is a global plan, and it's a regionalization plan. So there are 5 points, which they don't say openly, but you can find if you understand how to read their linguistic terms. There are 5 points that Agenda 21 seeks to, well, they would use the term overcome, but really to end: national sovereignty, control of money, laws, and borders, privacy, private property rights, gun rights in America, and cash. So, and free enterprise. So those are the 5 points that they want to end, and they want to do that because the justification is that that free enterprise is destroying the earth, et cetera, right? So that's basically what it is. Now, the end of the nation state comes down to this idea of regionalization, as we kind of talked about a little bit at the beginning. You can't control globally nations because nations have sovereign, especially in countries like America, sovereign declarations, and now the United Kingdom again after leaving the EU. So you have to kind of break those nations up into regions, and those regions look different in each nation. But essentially, you wouldn't live in a nation anymore. You would live in a region of the global state, what I call the global state. So in this case, let me just give you one example. So there's a region in Seattle, which they call Cascadia. So that will basically cover Washington state, a bit of Oregon state, and actually go into Canada. We talked about how it breaks national boundaries. So the Cascadia region basically goes from Oregon through Washington state to a portion of Western Canada. Now that region wouldn't be controlled by, the American government or the Canadian government. That region would have its own appointed leaders, but those leaders would get their overall authority from the global state, right? In this case, let's call it just the United Nations just to keep it easy for now. So let's say you have a global government like the UN, which dictates this kinds of policy, as you can imagine the policy being something simple like being carbon neutral. So the UN says, right, by 2030, everything needs to be carbon neutral, which it has said, right? Then in that mega region of your broken up nation, they will implement that carbon neutral thing. So therefore, there goes your cars, there goes your business, there goes the energy used in your house, there goes many, many things, farmland, all sorts of things, right? The way that they've managed to begin implementing this was launched in 92. The way that they've been implementing it kind of without people really knowing is that because it's a regionalized plan, they regionalize each piece of legislation. So I don't think obviously your listeners will know that I obviously did a presentation to the state GOP convention, Republican Party in Montana.
Yeah, I did share a post, and I would recommend that everyone go and watch that. I'll share that link again because it's a really, really good presentation, and it's quite brief as well. It's only about 20 minutes, isn't it?
Yeah, it's about 25 minutes. Yeah. So in that presentation, I essentially show how this is regionalized right now, right? So a lot of people will think, well, how are they going to take over a nation? But they're already doing it. That you just don't know that they've regionalized the plan. So it's not called Agenda 21 because Agenda 21 is the 21st century agenda. So it's supposed to go from the year 2000 to the year 2050. 2050 is the end. Agenda 2030. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, is it true, Mark, that Agenda 21 is so named because they planned to have it implemented by the 21st century?
Basically with Agenda 21, it's an interesting one because they wanted it basically achieved by 2050, right? So the plan of Agenda 21 is this is the end of nations agenda for the 21st century. So by 2050, we want to go from the year 2000 and take that 50 years to break down the nation state, and essentially consolidate the power to global governance. Well, people did kind of catch on to it, right? So like about 10 years ago in particular, 2012, 13, you saw a lot of people coming out, Rosa Koire and people like that, talking about Agenda 21. So a lot of people think that Agenda 2030 was like a shift, but it actually isn't. It's a milestone year of Agenda 21. So Agenda 21 is still being implemented, but the reason the focus has shifted to Agenda 2030, I think it's partly because people were finding out about Agenda 21, but the bigger part is actually because it's the major milestone year. So they want like a lot of this wrapped up by 2030, but 2030 isn't the end goal. 2050 is. So by 2030, we'll probably see, well, current trajectory, something like 70% of it implemented.
What specific aspects of Agenda 21 do you foresee them implementing by 2030 or aiming to? What do you think it is that they want to have in place by 2030?
Yeah, it's tough to know because it will differ region to region, but judging by, so the presentation I did to the Republican Party, for example, what I explained there is that it's localized, right? So it's not Agenda 2030, it's Manchester 2030. It's Warwickshire 2030. It's Glasgow 2030. It's in this case, it's Phoenix 2030 in Arizona. So it's never Agenda 2030. You're not going to find that anywhere. It's a localized version of that you're going to find. Now, if we look at the memorandum, like the one that I was talking about with them in Montana, what the county council have implemented is essentially carbon neutral by 2030. So we know for sure they'll want to reach at least that, which of course means no cars, no factories. It means a draconian measure of all energy that's used, like all energy, not just like what you use in your house, but what you consume as a person. Right. So for sure, that'll be implemented by 2030. And, why are the EU vaccine passports called green vaccine passports? Well, because eventually they're going to drop the vaccine part of that green passport and it'll just be a green passport. So you'll be locked into this region and you won't be able to leave that region unless you have enough, let's call it social credits on your green passport. So if you want to go, all right, I want to travel to even inside the nation, even if you want to travel from Seattle to Idaho, which is just the state next door, they want by 2030 you not to be able to travel unless you have enough social credits on that green passport. And there's a reason why they're calling them green vaccine passports, because this COVID narrative will shift to the climate narrative probably in a couple of years, and then it will kind of just follow that through.
Yeah, so basically any part of the agenda which they can pass off as addressing the environmental threat is pretty much what they're looking to get wrapped up by 2030. And then beyond that, the kind of aspects of the agenda which are more difficult perhaps for them to kind of sugarcoat in that way will be the leftover aspects that they need to bring in still.
Yeah, I think that's probably a fair assumption. I do think that it's difficult for us to know for sure. Like that's why I focus on the kind of the 5 points, because for sure we could go into like transhumanism and we could dive into all sorts of things. We could dive into global religion and the Vatican and things, but really there are 5 points we can prove that we know that they want to achieve roughly by that date, right? Which is the end of national sovereignty, the end of privacy, the end of private property, the end of free enterprise and cash, and the end of gun rights in America. So we know they want to achieve those at the very least, and that's essentially our sovereignty, right? Those are all the things that make us sovereign. I'm able to defend myself, I'm able to buy a house, I'm able to be left alone privately, I'm able to start a business, I'm able to travel. So all those things would be gone.
That's one of the parts of your presentation that I really liked, actually, the one that you did recently in Montana, was when you talked about how it just so happens that the things that they want to get rid of are the things which specifically enable any kind of remaining independence from the state. The ability to grow food and raise livestock, the ability to defend yourself, the ability to build community outside of a kind of urban environment. It just so happens that those things which enable some form of independence are the things which they are desperately trying to end. And one of the, I think we should get into solutions in a minute. But one of the things that concerns me most, and I think concerns many of us most. Well, I would say there are two things that concern me most. One is going to be access to any kind of healthcare. And number two is the ability to live on the land, because we know that a huge part of Agenda 21 is to get all people out of the rural areas, the wildlands as they call them, into the smart cities, the urban environments. And you detailed some of the ways in your presentation that they would seek to do that. If you could maybe just name some of those things.
Yeah, so just to preface that, because I don't think I covered it, the mega regions that people are supposed to be locked into would be essentially a smart city grid, so a technology controlled smart city, which means that, it's just China today. That's basically what it is. That's what technocracy is. And I also wanted to preface it by saying global governance isn't a conspiracy theory. The World Economic Forum use that term, United Nations use that term, so they're very open about the term. So to get people into cities, which is of course to make you dependent on the state, and by the state I don't just mean the government. In fact, if anything, the government, at least in the American context anyway, the government are actually even less a problem than the private businesses. But the state really is all of those entities, right? There is no, in technocracy, there's no separation because it's the science of social engineering. So economics, science, government, it's all one system, like China. So when I say the state, I mean all of those entities, not just the government. So to keep you in the city, tracked, chipped, traced, controlled, dependent, requires you to be out of rural areas, especially in America. Like we have a lot of autonomy in the rural areas out here. Like where I live in Arizona, I mean, there's not even any gun laws. I can grab my AR-15, I can throw it on my passenger seat and just drive down to the park legally, right? So, but as soon as you go to the city, that becomes a very different ballgame with the laws. Most major cities in the United States don't allow that. Don't even allow you to carry a handgun, let alone throw an AK-47 in the back of the car. So in this case, that's one aspect. The other aspect, of course, is that we grow our own food. All of the rural areas in Middle America, Kansas, Idaho, South Dakota, grow all the food. So they don't want that because, of course, well, we need to be dependent on them to be controlled. So how are they going to get us out of rural areas where we have a lot of autonomy and generally, just much higher morality in the populations? Well, they're going to have to do it non-violently in America because American gun owners, just Trump voting men, own a third of the world's guns. So they're going to do it not violently. They're going to do it by just shutting the power off in the town. So let's say you live in a small town, like I live in a fairly rural town in northern Arizona. They would just shut off the electricity. They would just shut off the water. They would just stop paving the roads. So a lot of the people don't quite understand how ingenious technocracy is because they think it's going to be like a Bolshevik thing where, and don't get me wrong, I'm not going to rule that out. There are insurgents, Black Lives Matter and all this nonsense. That's part of the insurgency. But ultimately, they know that it's going to be very difficult to pull that kind of stuff off. They're much too clever for that now. So they know that, well, we own this is them speaking, we own the water. It's our property. So we're just going to shut it off if you're not going to move. We're just going to not pave the roads. We're just not going to supply you nuclear energy anymore. And they'll force people to move that way. Oh, we'll just won't stock food in the stores anymore. As we get closer and closer up to 2030, it's just going to become so restrictive to live in those rural areas that people are going to be forced to move. They will then take back the real wealth, the property, the land. And then they'll put you in a little box, Brave New World style, with a little pod, and that will be the sterile life. But
it's ingenious, isn't it? Because you said there that there are different rules in terms of gun ownership, between the major cities of America and the outside of the cities. So if they can't just outright ban guns in America, what they can do is force people into the areas where they have already partially banned guns. And it's simple, but it's devious in its ingenuity, really.
And conservative types, especially in America, because conservative, don't get me wrong, there's a lot of problem with American conservatives, but they are generally a little more conservative than like European conservatives. Like most conservatives I know, even though they're a little too favorable to certain things, they are still, generally anti-abortion and things like that. So, but the thing with conservative people is that generally it's like you can't help but just want to follow the rules, right? Because it's like we're made that way because we invented high trust, especially in the English sense, which is really the core of American civilization. We invented high trust society, right? Where we're like, well, why would anyone lie to me? We're Anglo, right? So it's like we can't help but want to follow the rules because we're part of a system of centuries upon centuries of creating rules. So it's like it's ingrained in us to be good people, be good citizens. So you'll find that even if you move conservatives to the cities, like in LA, for example, where I lived for a while, we can't carry a gun. The conservative guys won't carry guns, even though they know it's shit, right? And and that's my fear, is that our tendency, which is a good civil building tendency, a tendency towards order, harmony, is also a detriment in this sense because we're just too comfortable by rules.
Yeah. Well, just before we move on to, because I think this kind of segues nicely into your America 21 initiative, but just before we go there, one question that I'm kind of struggling with myself, and I usually find that I can explain most policy in the context of what's going on. But one thing that's confusing me is that particularly in England, there's an awful lot of housing being built out in rural and semi-rural areas, which doesn't really make sense in the context of Agenda 21 wanting to force everyone out of the rural areas to rewild them and into urban areas. I mean, do you have any thoughts on that?
I don't know about the specifics of the situation, so you can send me some stuff and I can have a look. I haven't been paying too much attention to the UK this year, just because I've obviously had so much to focus on here.
Yeah,
but I would say that there's always going to be spots. So if we look at if you go to the presentation on the website, you can see the biodiversity map. And by the way, in page 350 of the UN's biodiversity assessment report, they state that livestock has to go, and centralization of all these resources, food, housing, welfare, all of that is in this assessment report. And they have a map, biodiversity map, and there's like red and yellow. The red is like partially used and the yellow is like not used at all. So essentially what this means is that there will be little parts of the countryside that you can use. So like that property might be for senior nurses, for example, or something, or a low-level member of parliament or something. It won't be for the great unwashed masses, most unlikely. But that being said, there will always be little bits of rural area that we are supposed to live. The issue is that we're not going to have access to all of our land, and even being able to live in those areas, we're not going to be able to own the property in those areas. So at least if this goes to its fruition.
Well, lots of people over here are snapping up rural property in Britain. I have a colleague who has spent a while trying to purchase rural property in Wales, and she's just been told by estate agent after estate agent that good luck. Anything that comes on the books is getting snapped up immediately, way over the asking price. So we have a lot of people buying up these more rural properties, especially now because people have found due to lockdown that they can actually work from anywhere, and many employers are allowing people to work from anywhere. So I'm just kind of wondering, this goes against the ultimate agenda, which is to get those people out of those rural properties and into the cities. And I'm just kind of wondering, it seems like they've kind of allowed this to happen, or they've certainly facilitated it. And I'm just, I'm just kind of pondering there. It may be one of those kind of questions that we have yet to kind of discover the answer to.
Well, part of it is that they have to rebuild the cities into smart cities, right? So as I when the Black Lives Matter nonsense was happening last year, I mean, I must have been one of the first people to point out that the destruction of cities is necessary. Not only is it about driving down the value so it can be bought up by BlackRock and Goldman Sachs, but it's also about the fact that those cities are archaic to the New World Order. In this case, those cities need to be rebuilt as smart cities, right? So that means that you have to have sensors put in to street lights and more cameras put in. Everything needs to be created with distance, because the social distancing is just about creating distance between people. So you'll find by around 2025 onwards, you'll start to see offices wider, desks far apart, doors without handles on, automatic. So they have to rebuild a lot of these things because the whole point is tech controlled and humans separated from one another.
Okay, and so many of those office spaces will become residential property.
It's very possible. Yeah, I have heard that. I don't know enough about it, but I have heard that there will be this kind of situation where you'll have, like office below and apartment above. I don't know for sure about that, but what I do know is that they need to rebuild the infrastructure. And to rebuild the infrastructure partly involves, buying it all up on the cheap from the economic damage they've done, and then in America, especially the physical damage they've done. And then from there, they can kind of rebuild it in this new sort of Babylonian image. And I think that that's part of the point. But they also, we also have to be realistic by the fact that as much as they control a lot of it, they don't control all of it, right? So there's always going to be parts of the narrative that they just can't control, and things that we do that they just can't control. And those are the things we want to exploit, right? So maybe they didn't actually want as many of us to move out the city as we did. Therefore, we have something we can exploit there, because if we have more people that actually do that, we actually, not only do we gain more autonomy by moving out of the city, but we also gain more political control in those areas before this comes to pass. So there is actually a lot of remedy in us actually continuing that trend and then just digging our heels in when we get there, rather than moving back to the city later.
Yeah, well, this is exactly what your new sort of fresh initiative. Mark has a new initiative called America 21, and I'm not sure if the website for that is currently up properly, but I'll put a link up when it is. But what's the web address? It's I don't know if you want to give it out now, Mark, or
21 century. Yeah, it's america21century.com. If for some reason.
So what is that basic? Yeah. So it should be back up soon, though. Mark mentioned. So what is if you give us an introduction to what the thinking is behind America 21?
Yeah, so America 21 is the America for the 21st century. So, obviously, as I said, this is my home now. Obviously, I moved here a few years ago. Now, I will be honest, I wasn't sure I'd be living here forever when I first moved here. I thought maybe I'd move back to England at some point, but the reality is that's just not ever going to be possible now anyway. So they're never going to let me leave again anyway. Because I'm obviously not getting the gene therapy, and I'm not going to do any of the nonsense. So reality is I probably won't ever be able to leave. But I do love America. America's great, and it's they've really retained a lot of those Anglo traditions that I always loved about England. So in the American context, what we're trying to do here is create our own version, right? We can talk about the problems all day, and there are a lot of problems, but ultimately we have to have agency. We have to have autonomy ourselves and go, well, we've been granted free will. We can make choices. Why not make our own choices in this scenario? Because I actually look at this situation and I see a lot of great opportunities in this situation. So America 21 is essentially the antithesis of Agenda 21, where we will create our own agenda for the 21st century for this country. And the major part of that is to separate from all global governance initiatives. A lot of the problems that people think are coming from the federal government are actually coming from global governance initiatives. So in this case, direct to the city. As I explained in the beginning, this is regionalization. So Biden for sure puts through some things, and Obama puts through some things. Actually, and I have many criticisms of Trump, but Trump actually was very good on this issue by pulling out of the Paris Climate Accord and actually being reversing Obama's damage to single family homes. So this is actually something Trump did a really good job on. But generally speaking, it's a city problem. It's a county problem. Therefore, we have a lot of control over it. We actually have a lot of ability. I mean, if it was a UN only problem or a federal government only problem, I would say, yeah, I mean, maybe there's nothing we can do, but it's implemented at the city council level, of which we do have a lot of control.
Yeah. So to a large extent, you have councils, not just in America, but all over Europe as well, who are irrespective of the national government, are signing up to these UN Agenda 21 initiatives of their own accord, and they're being passed off as as opposed to being kind of laws or policies, just these kind of innocent little initiatives. We're going, the UN believes that we should, cut, plant this many trees, and this is something that many people would say it's a good thing, but it's one of the things that's kind of sugarcoating the whole thing. But they'll say the UN wants this to happen by this point, so regardless of what the UK Parliament says, we are going to allocate some of our resources to meeting that goal. So what am I right in saying that what you're talking about is basically ensuring that those councils and districts, particularly in Central America, don't adopt any of those initiatives?
Correct. Yeah. So in this case, in the spirit of agency, in the spirit of taking initiative, let's say we have 9 years before the end of nations. It's very dramatic, but unfortunately, it's kind of the case. So in that time, what can we do? Well, if this global governance tentacle is in each region, in each city, in each county, we have a lot of control over that. I mean, especially if you live in conservative areas. So, for example, where I live in northern Arizona, very conservative area, they've implemented a lot of this stuff, but that's just because people don't know. If I alerted this town to what was going on, it would easily be able to be repealed because I have the population that would be on the side of America, nationalism, right? So in this case, if you're in an area that has, conservative leaning people, generally speaking, it is actually going to be fairly easy to repeal this stuff. You just have to find out your way in your region of reaching those people. And this is an important issue to tackle, not just because it's the end game of everything else, the COVID thing, the globalism thing, all of the stuff that we've been talking about for years. This is always the point of all of those things. But it's also something that's possible that we can do and can actually unify us. Like you and I, Dan, we may have like disagreements about X, Y, or Z, but those things are irrelevant when you're facing a predator, right? Like we have something that's trying to kill us here. Let's not be killed, and we can argue later. So in this case, you might have a good thing where you can unite everyone who's against the New World Order here, whatever their other persuasions are. So I think there's a lot of solution and a lot of remedy. But essentially what we're trying to do at America 21 is repeal in certain areas the UN initiatives, which will essentially stop those things becoming smart cities, which will essentially also stop those things becoming everything we've talked about. And then in other parts of the country, like Kansas, Oklahoma, South Dakota, there isn't any of this stuff. So our job there is just a prevention measure. Right. So what we do over the course of the next few years will be to ensure that they implement legislation that prevents this from ever happening there. And in places like Idaho and Montana or Utah, for example, there's like only one town in the whole state. So it's going to be very easy. Like in Montana, everyone, all of those politicians I spoke to were on my side. They were like, yeah, this is bullshit. We need to get rid of this. Because there's only one town in that entire state, which is twice the size of Britain, that has implemented it. So we have a lot of leverage in a lot of those areas.
So I suppose really what it comes down to is many of the, the kind of committee members and whatever, the people with any kind of political clout in those rural conservative areas of America, the only problem at the moment is that they see lots of these initiatives as innocent or irrelevant. So I guess it's just going to be a case of educating them about how insidious they actually are.
Right. Yeah. Exactly.
And then quite quickly they'll change their tune.
Yeah, I mean, I noticed Montana, a lot of these Republican guys I spoke to, that they might be directors, policymakers, whatever. You know, a lot of those guys really had no idea that this was going on. Like they'd heard of the councils of governments, for example, which is an American organization that is non-elected that implements a lot of this stuff in the state. So once I extrapolated what that actually is to them, they were like, "Oh, wow, that's crazy." So they just didn't even know. These are the people making policy. They don't even know. You know, they see sustainable development, which is the key word that I always tell people: red alert. Every time you see the term sustainable development, you should be absolutely assured that that is going to result in global governance every single time without exception. So that's all you need to look for. Look for sustainable development in your town, as we're going to do a tour kind of across the country. So the next day I think I have to go to South Carolina. And then, you know, we're going to just keep going and doing these conversations to the policymakers so we can continue repealing. And we already had a pretty good result. I mean, in Montana, 3 weeks after I did the presentation, the governor came out, ended his climate membership. So, you know, we are already seeing results. This is working.
And congratulations. Yeah.
Thank you. It's been a hell of a lot of work, man. I've lost like so many thousands of dollars of time and energy this year by putting it into this, but of course it's necessary. So, you know, we are seeing results is the point. And if we just act with a little bit of agency, there's a lot we can do to prevent this. So my hope for the future is essentially we carve out a new America. Now, I'm not talking about secession because that's treason, and I'd never say anything that was treasonous, obviously. What I'm talking about is more of an informal separation. So in this case, let's say we carve out everything from Idaho down to Oklahoma and Texas. That's like 15 states or so in the middle of the country. We would operate completely on constitutional law and nothing to do with these global governance mandates, whereas the East Coast and the West Coast would continue going into technocracy, would continue going into Agenda 21, and inevitably be absorbed into global governance. But that's fine. So that's what they want.
Yeah, in a sense, they're seceding.
Yes, exactly the point. And that's I've been trying to hammer this home to a lot of my conservative friends for months now, where they're like, "Oh, we should secede." I'm like, no, you're getting it wrong. They're the ones seceding. We want to keep America. They're the ones that are going into global governance. They're the ones that are adopting non-American mandates and putting it into law, not us. So they're the ones seceding. We are the ones that are keeping America. So we would essentially keep America in the middle, and they would inevitably secede, not formally, but informally, maybe formally by 2050. But by 2030, it would be just more informal, where these mega regions would become, you know, their legislative center as opposed to the Supreme Court in DC. In our case, we would just keep everything as it is. What we're just trying to do is cut out the cancer in this case, right? So we're not trying to change America. We're trying to keep it. So what we're going to do is we're just going to informally separate politically, because here's the thing, you know, like if you go to, this is a problem that many of my predecessors have done, in my opinion, incorrectly. They go to places like San Francisco and they try to fight in San Francisco to end global governance. That's like me dropping into Pakistan and talking about Jesus. Like, you know, is that really going to work? You know, like, is that, you know, it's
not at all.
So, right. So it's like, you know, so the point is that I focus on where I know we can get real victories. And also, you know, where I know the population is a moral population, generally speaking, and a population I want to live with. And the reality is the coasts like New York and California, and they've made their choice. They want global governance. You know, they want the climate change stuff. So let's let them have it. And in the middle, we will keep America. So that's kind of our long-term hope. And over the course of the next few years, we're just going to kind of, you know, go through these states and continue doing this work until we get more ends of climate membership and repeal this stuff and add prevention legislation in, which will be the end point, which will be the important part. We need the prevention legislation in to ensure it doesn't happen again. And this is very possible. As I explained in the presentation, you know, we in America, there are lots of states and counties that have Second Amendment sanctuary counties and states, which basically means that when Biden says we're going to ban your AR-15s, Arizona just says, nope, we're a sanctuary county. We're not listening to. They basically do what the blue states do with immigration, where they have like sanctuary cities. In the red states, you have like Second Amendment sanctuary counties and states. So we would be adopting that model where we would have essentially global governance sanctuary states.
And I guess any individuals who are in the kind of, the heart of the lion's den, so to speak, would or should at least be beginning to make moves to move, physically, geographically into the more rural conservative parts of America. Really, the onus is on them now. People can talk about kind of saving those areas, but as you have alluded to, those areas can't really be saved at this point. All that can be saved are those awakened individuals who are still present in those areas and trying to bring them into the more sane areas, right?
Yeah, because just to play devil's advocate, we really have no right to force those people not to, right? Like, if you think about it in a way, like, do we really have the right to tell all the Californians to not be in global governance when that's what they want? I mean,
yeah.
The reality is that it's really on us to go where our people are and to leave them where their people are. And, I've thought about this a lot because I used to live in Southern California before we moved to Arizona. And, I thought, oh, there's a lot of good things you can salvage in California, but it's just not possible. And the reality is we would be wasting time. We would be kind of doing what people have been doing now for decades, which is wasting that precious time we have. Which I don't want to do. Like, I'm too pragmatic for that. So we do have the impetus to move. Yeah.
I wholeheartedly agree with that. I think that's a really important point. And I was talking to one of my brothers earlier today, actually, about that very thing. The fact that, we can be disappointed and angry at those people we know who have worn the mask, adhered to lockdown restrictions, got the injection and mocked people like us for exposing it for what it really is. We can get angry and disillusioned with those people, but is it really fair to drag them kicking and screaming into our kind of level of awakenedness? It's not really, because each of us is on a this touches on a very kind of spiritual aspect of the whole thing. Each of us is on a path, and it's not fair to kind of it's kind of like if you were to be, play chess and demand that rook should be able to jump 7 spaces instead of however many it is, 3, whatever. I forget my chess rules there, but point is, it's like, on a kind of spiritual level, there is this kind of order and this pattern that has been built up for each of us, and we the likes of us are on this kind of trajectory that we're very, we have a great conviction over. It's not fair of us to expect those of us who don't have that same conviction and aren't ready for those big moves to make those moves. So I very much agree with you, and this actually this segment's really nicely into a topic I wanted to discuss with you, which I think is really important, which is the issue of consent. Now, you're one of the people that has spoken most regularly about the fact that everything that's being done to us is with our consent. Yeah. So I know lots and lots of people now are concerned about the idea of forced injections. You don't really foresee that happening, do you?
No. So this Roman law, which is where English common law is roughly based in, and by the way, English common law is really one of the greatest gifts England gave to the world. So I'm very pro English common law. The American system is completely English common law. Right, self-defense, equal measure, all those things.
But more clearly codified. Yeah.
More clearly codified, yeah, because a lot of our strongest men came over here. They were like, a lot of those early Englishmen were like, we want to chart a new path where we can essentially create that version of England we love without the
do it even better. Structure.
Yeah, exactly. And for the first 150 years, it was just all English people here, right? But anyway, so the point is that English common law system, which really is the Roman system, is all commerce based. It's really, really important for people to understand. Every bill, every contract, every government thing is an offer. In this case, what it is that it is what they call equity. So you have to consent as part of the agreement. Now, consent can come in all sorts of ways. It can be consent by omission, but you do have to consent. So I'll give you a great example if they were to do mandatory vaccinations, for example, and how it wouldn't actually work if you understood consensual law. So if they say, look, you need a vaccination to get into this place, rather than saying no, because if you say no in this old Roman system, you're what's called not in honor. So what you would have to do is stay in honor. So in this case, you would have to just go, look, I'll take the vaccine, no problem, if you can provide me the strand of RNA that they call SARS-CoV-2. If you can cite to me where that strand of RNA exists, I'll happily take the vaccine. So what you do here is you reverse it onto them, right? But by asking those questions, you stay in honor in this law of commerce. And every law in the Western system is driven by this Roman law of commerce. So that's why it always involves consent, and it always will, the whole thing, all the way through to the very end. So there are easy ways around it if you understand this stuff. And unfortunately, a blanket no actually puts us in dishonor, which means that we actually don't have a leg to stand on. I'll give you an example. Let's say you're getting arrested and they say you have a right to remain silent. Well, actually remaining silent is by omission admitting that they're correct. So the best thing to do in this scenario is to say something akin to, officer, I will stay silent, but I just want you to know for the record, for the filming camera you have, that you are arresting me by force, right? By coercion, without my consent. So our job in this consensual game is just to always voice and always ask questions. They have made so much progress on the basis of knowing that most people don't understand that we live in a commercial law system. So I don't see how even if they were to do like, quote, mandatory vaccinations, like let's say they came to my door with a vaccination, just by going through that process we just went through, we would easily be able to avoid it because they have to go along with that system. The entire court system is built on that system. So if this were to go to court, it would fall through, and they know that, which is why it's inevitable that it can't be forced. I would also say to people, on a spiritual sense, like if you really think about it, it has to be consented because you have to accept the poison pill. You have to accept it for it to truly work. They know that forcing you to do something like gun to the head, take the vaccine is unsustainable. But they do know that if you choose it, or you think you choose it, it can last forever, right? So if you think you're doing a great thing by getting the vaccine, by going into the smart city, by gutting out the economy, by breaking up the nation, by removing borders, whatever these things are, they know they will get away with it and it will last forever. If they force it upon you, they know they're going to get resistance. So we also have to understand that these people are better than that, right? Look at the last year and a half. They did it almost all without real force. We saw a few things. We saw a few police pushing people over and things like that. But I mean, 60 million people went along with it. And how many police pushed them?
Yeah,
I mean,
well,
0.01%.
Yeah, I've got big questions about most of those leaked videos as well. I see no reason why we should accept them at face value, because if you were behind this agenda to get everyone to comply with this whole thing, what easier way could you possibly find to do that than to leak a certain number of videos showing people who are not complying being dealt with with violence and threats and arrest and things like this. Immediately you're going to get compliance from the vast majority of people who see those supposedly leaked videos. So I'm not saying that I know that for sure, but I do think it's something that we need to consider. So yeah, I do. I mean, and I don't think we should go too deeply into the spiritual aspect, but another thing that I will say is that if that they want to own your soul, that how they can't do that unless you have agreed to, because on a spiritual level, there's no such thing as kind of as physical force. All there is the consent on that kind of immaterial level. All there is consent or no consent. So it doesn't matter how that they could come along and physically force you to do something, but if you've not given your consent on a spiritual level, which is your will, then they've actually achieved nothing whatsoever.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And that's why consent is so important. Just there's many reasons for it. On a spiritual level, it's about absolving themselves of responsibility. And by the way, that goes back to the commercial law system that I was just speaking about. The reality is that commercial law system, like George Bush didn't kill anyone in Iraq, right? So that's a very important thing. He convinced
You mean
to do it.
he personally didn't? Yeah.
He personally didn't, right? Yeah. I mean, I'm not saying that he isn't an evil bastard, because of course he is. What I'm saying is that in his mind, in this system, he didn't. He didn't pull a single trigger. He convinced you to do it. So this is always the point of that system I was talking about. This kind of commercial law system. There always has to be honor. They understand it. George Bush, in his mind, can say, "I stayed in honor. I didn't. I knew it was a lie, and I didn't pull a trigger." Right?
Yeah.
He convinced you to do it, and you consented to it. So this goes through deeply into that spiritual aspect, because the whole thing is about consent. You have to choose it.
In their view, if you were stupid enough to be deceived, then that's on you. It's not on them at all.
Yeah. Right. Well, that's the thing about them absolving themselves of karmic responsibility, and you taking that responsibility off them. But there is that other aspect, which is in general psychopathology. What you'll find with studies of, let's say, narcissists, sociopaths, psychopaths a little less so, but it definitely happens. But psychopaths are just a little more cunning. But you'll find this scenario where they will leave teasers around. Let's say you're I don't know, cheating on your wife. And if you're like a sociopathic type, you may, any kind of psychopathology, you will leave clues, right? And what those clues will do is you'll be saying to the person, if you are stupid enough not to see what I'm doing to you, then you deserve it, right?
Yeah.
So this is the kind of the gaslighting thing. I mean, it's insidious. Obviously, it's evil, because the reason that person doesn't, or that person is, quote, stupid and doesn't see it, is because they're not a complete, messed up person, and they're innocent. Try to look at the good. Yeah, exactly. They're high trust, as Western culture has always been. So that's how we've been so easily subverted, is because of that trust, because we generally look for the good.
What we're really talking about are two conflicting systems of morality, really, aren't we?
Yes. Right. Yeah. Exactly.
And that's really the crux of everything. We've got this kind of innocent, high trust society, of which European man is probably the pinnacle, versus this other very insidious, perverse system of morality, whereby you are absolved of any guilt if the other person was stupid enough to be duped, or didn't pick up on the signs that you left, or if you're telling that, people talk about predictive programming, and I forget the phrase. You'll probably be able to put the word in my mouth here, but when they tell you what they're going to do in advance.
Revelation of method. Yeah.
Revelation of the method, yeah, exactly. As far as they're concerned, if they do that, then they're absolved of all guilt, and all kind of immoral standing. So,
we saw that example with Fauci. So on March 26th, 2020, right, the beginning of this nonsense, this COVID-19 nonsense, right? So Fauci said in the New England Medical Journal, March 26, 2020, that this was akin to a seasonal flu, the 0.1% mortality rate. And then the next day came on TV, on the White House press conferences they were having, and said that it was a 1% fatality rate, 10 times higher. Now, what he's essentially doing there is he's saying, look, in the real work, the scientific papers, I told you the truth all along, and it was right there.
Yeah.
Right. And he did in March of 2020. So that's another great example of, at the beginning of all of this, how many of them told you that it really wasn't that bad. And even the World Health Organization said lockdowns weren't a good measure of dealing with it. So they feel they've absolved themselves, right?
Yeah. In Britain, we have Matt Hancock, who again, similar thing. He stood up in some kind of public setting and said that there's no proof of asymptomatic transmission. Yet his entire policy on BBC News and Sky News and whatnot has been to tell people specifically that we are doing this because of asymptomatic transmission of the virus. So, but someone said to me a little while ago, and I found this very, very interesting, that if you have like a modern smart TV and you look through the categories of TV channels, the news channels actually come under entertainment. And I think this is probably one of the kind of strange keys to all of this is, everybody watches, Fox News, BBC News, whatever, Fox, Sky News. Everyone watches these assuming that, it's the news, it's reporting facts. They never consider for a moment that this might actually be an act. It might be a form of entertainment. And if it's a form of entertainment, then there is absolutely no requirement for the people appearing on those channels to tell you any kind of factual or scientific truth.
Yeah, right. So, and that's actually a really good point. I didn't notice that, but now that you say it, I mean, it makes total sense. Yeah, of course. The categorization is important because, again, it gives them, it absolves them of responsibility. And they're like, well, why would you believe it? It's entertainment. Yeah, it makes sense.
Right. Well, yeah, we've been chatting, I think, for a good hour and 15 minutes there. And yeah, I think we covered some really, really good stuff. And Mark and I have kind of chatted privately about, because Mark is a Christian mystic, I believe. Yeah. Is that a fair way of describing it?
Yeah, I think that's a fair way, yeah.
Yeah. And I myself consider myself a heathen. And there's a huge crossover in our kind of moral framework, but there are some kind of some contrasts and differences there, which I think Mark and I are going to have another chat on this channel separately at some point to go over. So I think that'll be a good one on a different subject. But yeah, thank you very much for chatting with me today, Mark. And is there anything else that you wanted to kind of hammer home as we finish up here?
Yeah, I'd be happy to have that conversation. It'd be really cool. I would just add a disclaimer that I'm really far off your average Christian. So therefore I wouldn't use me as a barometer. Either if that's good or bad, that would be your choice, but I wouldn't use me as a barometer for Christianity as it is today.
No, not at all.
So so final thing, I would just say, obviously jump to the website. It has been down for the last 24 hours for some unknown reason. But we're getting that fixed right now. So it should be up again, this afternoon. Whenever it's up, obviously America21century.com, jump to there, watch the presentation. It's only 25 minutes long. It's under the Learn section. And if you want to deep dive, you can read the thesis that I wrote, it's 14,000 words, which pulls this whole thing apart. I would say just, stay in touch. And as we continue to grow, try to take as many of these tools as you can that, because I've given you all the organizations, I've given you the political framework, the names. So all you really need to do is take this and then just go to your city council and ask your most likely conservative representatives to get it chopped. Because a lot of the work has already been done, like the R&D work has already been done. So all people need to do at this point is take that work and actually start implementing it in their town. And as we grow, we are going to try to cover as much of the country as possible, but it's best not to wait. And obviously, if you're in the UK, you're in Europe, it would be good to see this kind of same project spread over there.
Yeah, I think I would say, and I don't want to go too deeply into this, but I do have my concerns about how possible it would be to implement the same kind of Agenda 21 initiative in Britain or other areas of Europe, just because, as you said so yourself, American conservatives are much more conservative than British conservatives. British conservatives have moved so willingly with the Overton window that at this point, I can't even think of a single politician who would be willing to put their neck on the line for what's going on. That doesn't mean to say that there aren't any. I don't follow politics closely at all myself, so it's something that I need to look into, and maybe it is possible. I just think it needs a bit of investigation. I think it's going to be easier to implement in America.
For sure, yeah. The constitutional system gives us a lot more, sovereignty of region to region, which for sure will help. And if that is the case, I said in one of my podcasts earlier in the week, that my hope actually for the long term would be that we just set this kind of new America or existing America up as a freedom sanctuary for people from Western Europe and stuff to come to. That's actually what it was founded for in the beginning. If you read the founding fathers, that was the point. Thomas Paine, of course, was an Englishman. He said not only is this going to be a free country for the English, but for all Europeans. So maybe one day we can reach that point again. That's obviously a while away, but that is something that I have in the periphery for, as we get further to that timeline.
Great. Well, the other thing that I haven't mentioned is that Marc has a really good Telegram channel called Marc Malone's Bulletin. So, if you're not following it yet, he doesn't have anywhere near as many followers as he deserves to have on that channel, because he posts some really good stuff, and there's a really good chat group that's linked to it as well, which I'm a part of. I encourage you to follow that, because as you will have heard listening to this, Marc is pretty knowledgeable about this stuff, and we can learn a lot from him in how we need to prepare for what's coming. So thank you, Marc. It was really good to speak to you finally.
Yeah, you too, Dan. I appreciate it, mate. We'll have that follow-up conversation soon, for sure.
Great. All right, nice one. Well, everyone take care, and I'll speak to you soon.